All right, Annie. Those were some very, very kind words, very kind words. And it looks like a few people have gotten some questions in already. So, welcome to the Fiveable broadcast, and very excited to be working with y'all tonight. And excited to hear, hey, Stefania, and very excited to hear. It looks like these broadcasts are going to be, to be public through the remainder of the spring. So, I think that that's going to be awesome. All right. Somebody's living in a in a democracy. Okay. Sorry, I'm kind of recovering from being sick, but the good news is I can't get you sick over the internet. So we're going to be good on that. And so let's go ahead and get into it. Okay, I believe our topic this time is the Gilded Age. So really, any kind of questions dealing with the Gilded Age are going to have priority this time. Okay, so as far as that goes, all right, that is a good one, Katie. So when we think about this, is a really good question. I think it goes into comparison. Okay, because this would really be a good LEQ topic if you think about it. Like if they asked. For example, evaluate the extent to which, the actions of the U.S. government, U.S. government policies regarding business were different, were different from each other in the Gilded Age and in the Progressive Era. Okay, so that's when we think about comparing. I think that this works out really well because in the Gilded Age, essentially, the government was all in on business. Okay, pro business, pro business, pro business. Now, as far as evidence, first of all, the Pacific Railway Act. Okay, so as far as the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, the government was very much on the side of business. Okay, here are your subsidies. Let's get this thing built. Okay, and then when you look at something like the Sherman Antitrust Act, that even when the government took action to try to regulate business during the Gilded Age, the regulations themselves, they were too weak to really do anything or accomplish anything. So as far as that is concerned, that would be another one. Whereas during the progressive era, your counterpoint to the Sherman Antitrust Act would be the Clayton Antitrust Act during the Progressive Era. That was passed during Woodrow Wilson's presidency. And the Clayton Antitrust Act was actually, that had teeth in it. That was something that, that was helpful as far as the government being able to use it against monopolies and trust, which the Sherman Act was certainly used. I mean, Taft actually, broke up quite a few trusts during his time with the Sherman Act, but the Clayton Act was a lot stronger. Now, another thing the Clayton Act did, so while we're thinking about comparing these two, is that the Clayton Antitrust Act exempted labor unions from its requirements. So what we see during the Progressive Era is that the government starts to be friendlier toward labor unions. Now, this, of course, started when Teddy Roosevelt, during the anthracite coal strike, when Teddy Roosevelt, during that strike, ended up saying that I'm going to invite not only the owners and the management, but I'm also going to invite, the strikers. Okay. So that would be, be another one there. Okay, so as far as that goes, that's another one. Now, when you think about the Gilded Age, that every time there was some sort of strike, so for example, the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, that would be a case where you see that the federal government was getting involved in that against the strikers, where armed troops were being called up to put down the strike. Whereas you see during the Progressive Era, policy toward labor unions, federal policy toward labor unions gets to be a lot friendlier. Okay, so I think that when if you were framing a thesis for this, now we would say that the Progressive Era, it's not like socialism per se. I mean, the progressives of the early 20th century still favored a market economy and private ownership of the means of production, but they were more receptive to government regulation of business than the government was during the Gilded Age, during which time it was exclusively pretty much on the side of big business. All right. So that's something that I would, as far as the comparison, that although the government, was supportive of a market economy in both cases, government legislation during the Gilded Age was primarily focused on, helping and supporting big business, whereas, during the progressive era, you see more emphasis on the government regulation of business. Okay, so we've got that. Now, remember, ladies and gentlemen, we've got several several questions here, and you can give questions up votes. Okay, so as far as that goes, now Aiden is asking about immigration during the Gilded Age. Okay, now there are a couple things that we need to look at. Now, first of all, would be Chinese immigration. Okay, so the Chinese are coming in, in the late 19th century, and for a while nobody's really complaining. Well, people are complaining, but it's not getting up to the government level because there was a need for cheap labor. Okay, there was a need for unskilled cheap labor to build the railroads. Okay, a lot of Chinese Americans were building the railroads. Now, once the transcontinental railroads were finished, and by the 1880s, we've got several transcontinental railroads that have been completed. Then all of a sudden, these outcries against, against Chinese immigration, some of these coming from the labor unions, okay, because the labor unions, which, the more successful labor unions like the AFL, okay, Samuel Gompers, these are native-born white men. And what they see is, the more immigration coming in, that is increasing the labor supply. So when you look at this from a supply and demand standpoint, an increase in the labor supply is going to have an effect that it's going to decrease the value of labor. And so, as far as that goes, labor unions at the turn of the 20th century were very anti-immigrant because this is, something that is bringing down wages. It's increasing the labor supply. It's bringing down wages. And so the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was passed by Congress in the 1880s, this was the first law that was passed by Congress that specifically restricted immigration, from a, really, I think possibly from anywhere, but especially from a specific country or a specific group being banned. Okay. And so that, now, of course, there's also the Gentleman's Agreement with Japan. Now, with Japan, which Japan was a rapidly westernizing nation, this was, Japan defeated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War at the turn of the century. And of course, Teddy Roosevelt was responsible for the peace there, the Treaty of Portsmouth. And this, this is basically the, first time that two countries have gotten together and asked the United States to mediate. Okay, so you've got Japan and Russia that are like, you know what, we'll get the United States to help us make this treaty. And remember that, in 1860, the United States is just a bunch of farmers killing each other. And so the United States is becoming, more of a world power here. And so as far as that goes, the Gentleman's Agreement with Japan was simply that Japan agreed that in return for the United States not banning immigration from Japan, that Japan would basically keep people from getting out. Okay, Japan would, make sure that people weren't leaving Japan for the United States. And so as far as that's concerned, that's Asian immigration, which was one of these nativist peoples during the Gilded Age. Now, the other one, and this is the turn of the 20th century, and this is starting during the Gilded Age. It's about 1890 to 1920, where you've got what are called the new immigrants, okay, which, of course, there's nothing so new about them anymore, given that that's a century ago. But a lot of you watching tonight may be descended from new immigrants. If your ancestors are Italian, Polish, Greek, Russian, Jewish, okay, and so as far as that's concerned, if that's your ancestry, that's what's coming in as far as between 1890 and 1920, and that's southern and eastern the epicenters of immigration at that time. Now, before 1890, most of the immigration from Europe had come from the northern and western parts of Europe. So when you're dealing with, like the British Isles, Germany, Scandinavia, these were the people who were already there. So southern and eastern Europe, they were certainly there. You don't really have Protestants to speak of in southern and eastern Europe. And of course, although there was some Irish immigration, the United States was still, predominantly Protestant. And then these countries, you didn't have a lot of English speakers coming in from these countries, and they did not have they did not have a history of Republican institutions. And so these immigrants, now they also were coming from, largely rural areas. They were unskilled. And so there was a lot of opposition there. Now, the other thing, on one hand, there was opposition from labor unions and from others, but at the same time, there was also, like, the progressives. When they're looking at this, they're thinking in terms of not of what can we do to keep these immigrants out, but when these immigrants get here, what can we do to help them assimilate? Okay, what can we do to help them assimilate? What can we do to help them fit in? And that's where Jane Addams comes in. Okay, Jane Addams, Addams. I've seen her on lots of tests. Test people love to ask about her. She was a sociologist who ran the Hull House in Chicago. So you want to make sure I would write down Jane Addams as someone who is a leader in this settlement house movement that was responsible for helping immigrants to assimilate. All right. And so those are the major, the major immigration waves during the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. All right. So that would be in effect there. And so can I talk about the history of Tammany Hall? Okay. Tammany Hall, it's really not something that, I'm kind of curious here. I want to see, let's see, APUS history, course description. Okay. Let me see if Tammany Hall even comes up in the course description. I'm kind of curious about that. Let's see. Okay, yeah, I get asked about Tammany Hall a lot, but Tammany Hall, now it doesn't mean that it's completely useless. There are a lot of things that don't show up in the course description, but typically if a word doesn't show up in the course description, hey, Hannah, all right, coming over to us from Long Island. So as far as that goes, like for this to have so much interest for something that's never specifically mentioned in the course description, but, I can tell you, I mean, this is Boss Tweed's outfit, that you've got, as Haruko says, political machines, political corruption. And this is something that essentially the late 19th century was the pinnacle of political corruption in the United States. Like at no point before or after has government been so corrupt. Okay, like you've got cartoons like that cartoon, The Bosses of the Senate. Okay, so if you haven't seen that one before, all right, The Bosses of the Senate. Let me pull that up and show that to y'all, just so most of y'all have seen this, but I think it's one of those things, kind of like the American Progress, where that Manifest Destiny cartoon. That's something that I think people can't see enough of. This is another one of those things. Okay, so this affects the popular perception that the government was being controlled by the trust. It's being controlled by the wealthy, by the monopolists, and all of that kind of stuff. Okay, so as far as that goes, this is a Senate of the monopolists, by the monopolists, for the monopolists. Okay, and so as far as that goes, we see that these bosses there, the people's entrance up here is closed. Okay, so the bosses of the Senate, and this idea that now the other thing that I always show up. Then as far as that goes, the other thing that is worth noting, and it's not just the Senate. If we were to go to Grant administration scandals. Okay. Grant administration scandals. And there's a whole Wikipedia page. Like you've got over 10 of them during the Ulysses S. Grant administration, where members of his cabinet were involved in things that they weren't supposed to be involved in. Okay. And so as far as that goes, now also the fight over political patronage, that's something as well that you might remember when Jackson came in, they had the spoils system, okay, which Jackson, when he started that, it's just this pattern of, somebody gets into office and you start firing everybody, like everybody that was already there. And before the Pendleton Civil Service Act, which was passed during the Gilded Age, you had basically this idea that anytime a party gets in, they clean house. Like the president of the United States before civil service reform could hire and fire the local postmaster. Okay, like today, because of the Pendleton Act and other acts that have come later, the president only has the power to appoint only the very top layers of the federal bureaucracy. That most of the federal bureaucracy is protected by civil service legislation. Okay, most of the federal bureaucracy is protected. And so, I would put Tammany Hall and Boss Tweed in with this whole pattern of political corruption during the Gilded Age. Like if you're writing about political corruption or corruption in general during this time, Tammany Hall and Boss Tweed would be a good piece of supporting evidence. Also, you might want to note Thomas Nast, okay, the cartoonist. Thomas Nast was the one who was doing the cartoons that were, critical of the Tweed ring, okay? Because everybody knew that this corruption was going on and nobody was really doing anything about it. Of course, there was Samuel Tilden, who was the Democratic candidate for president in 1876, who did something about, the problems with Boss Tweed, Tammany Hall, and all of that. And just to make clear, political machines, these are urban, urban machines that are tied typically at this time, they were tied to the Democratic Party. And as immigrants came off the boat, people would meet them. They'd help them find a place to stay. They'd help them find a job. And then when it came election day, they wanted their vote to keep them in office. And you would have local party bosses and all of that kind of stuff. All right, so going on with that. All right, so let's take a look here. We've got a few things here. All right, and let's see. All right, so can I talk about and I want to make sure that Gilded Age questions are getting priority, and then I'm going to go to some other ones, okay? So as far as I mentioned already, the Sherman Antitrust Act, okay, that one of the big problems during the Gilded Age was the formation of trusts, okay? Now, I tell you, I don't know if anybody's watching this Dairy Girl show. If you haven't, it's on Netflix. It's hilarious. You have to turn the subtitles on because they have these really thick Irish accents. But as far as that goes, there's one where they want to go to Paris, but then, one of the girls says, well, maybe ask your parents if you've got a trust fund. And it ends up, no, they don't have a trust fund. It's like only rich kids have trust funds. And trust funds are basically, it's not like when I have money in an account, like I've got a bank account that is like the money in that account is set aside for expenses having to do with my daughter. And that's not a trust fund because I have that money. Now, a trust fund is like where you've put it away. It's held in trust and somebody else is supervising it. And, when the kid needs money or when the kid reaches a certain age, then they've got access to their trust fund. Okay. So a trust is essentially like, instead of like, not every like Standard Oil refinery would be Standard Oil per se, but you would have these different companies that are put together under a common board of directors. They're held in trust. Okay. And so as far as that goes, trust are these combinations of businesses that instead of competing with each other, they're getting together and they're setting common policies. Okay, they're setting common policies. And so as far as that goes, Okay, yeah, the Sherman Antitrust Act. Basically, we need to break up these monopolies and even these de facto monopolies. Now, the Sherman Act, remember, as I said earlier, ended up being very weak. Now, the Interstate Commerce Act, this set up the Interstate Commerce Commission, and if I'm not mistaken, just want to make sure. Act. It set up the Interstate Commerce Commission. This is really the first time that the government got involved in regulating the railroads. Okay, so it's designed to regulate the railroad industry. Okay, so it created the Interstate Commerce Commission, and that was designed to regulate the railroads. Excuse me. All right, and I'm being asked here. Let's see. Okay, I think I've got this twice about railroads. Let's see. Okay, or maybe it's just here. How did railroad owners try to eliminate competition? I'm not sure about that. One thing, this is kind of a vague question. I'm not sure if it's really in bounds for the exam, but a few things I could tell you is one thing that the railroads, they were where they were because the government was funding them. Like the transcontinental railroads, the ones that were subsidized by the government, they were getting government money. The Pacific Railway Act, this is the first time that federal money was given directly to corporations. So when a corporation was chosen, like, oh, you get to build a transcontinental railroad, then there you go right there. I mean, because you're getting subsidized by the government to lay the track, you're getting these land grants. So as far as that goes, I don't know if it's so much like eliminating competition as what they call in business barriers to entry. Okay. So when there are barriers to entry, it's like, well, if I'm the Union Pacific Railroad or the Central Pacific Railroad, and I just got a bunch of help from the federal government in forms of subsidies and land grants to build this railroad, well, if somebody else wants to do it, they're going to have to like make the investment themselves, which you can't do it just one person. You got to get a bunch of investors. Now, James J. Hill did it with the Great Northern Railroad, but, I don't know necessarily if they're doing things just to eliminate competition. But one thing that a lot of people complained about, and I don't know, sometimes it's like people complain about things, but when you step back and look at them, for example, the railroads were giving like John D. Rockefeller preferential rates. Like John D. Rockefeller demanded preferential rates. And the thing is that when it comes down to it, if a railroad's going to give John D. Rockefeller a discount because of volume, then that's reasonable from a market standpoint because, well, he's doing so much volume, you give him a volume discount. And so little people, they thought, they're like, hey, this isn't any good because we're not, it's not because we're trying to make ends meet, and John D. Rockefeller's getting a better rate than we are. Now, when it comes down to it, that's where you get into populism, like this cry for the federal government to either regulate the railroads, or the populists wanted the government to nationalize, to just get rid of to take over the railroads entirely, to get rid of private ownership of railroads. So I don't know necessarily that they're trying to eliminate competition as much as it's difficult to get into that game because it was very expensive to get that going. All right, Annie, what is the difference between robber barons and captains of industry? It is it's only semantics, okay? Like when you say captains of industry, it's like, well, this is somebody who's productive. So when you look at John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, Cornelius Vanderbilt, are these people who have created wealth and made our lives easier? Now, obviously, these people have gotten rich, okay? But when somebody's gotten rich, you ask yourself, has this person helped society? Have they created wealth? Is society as a whole better off because of them? Or have they taken wealth from other people? Okay, so the former is captains of industry. The latter, somebody's calling them robber barons. It has the connotation that almost like all of this wealth was here, and then these people have taken it and they've hoarded it, which to me is, just grossly inaccurate in the sense that, it's like John D. Rockefeller came up with a more efficient way to refine oil, and he did it cheaper. He had oil better. Like when you think the Standard Oil Company, this oil is not going to blow up. Okay. So when it comes down to it, like the average consumer, because of John D. Rockefeller, they're getting cheap oil, they're getting oil cheap, and they're getting quality oil, and they know that they can trust it. And so, Rockefeller, even though he became very rich, what people have to remember is there's a lot of economic growth during this time. Now, the term Gilded Age is kind of a cynical term, first applied, I believe, by Mark Twain, who had a gift for, had a very sharp wit. And what we have to remember about the Gilded Age, because gilded means like, okay, it's got gold on top of it, but when you scratch the surface, it's not, it's not made of gold. But when it comes down to it, the rich were very rich at this time. Now, it was a really bad time to be poor. Then again, I always ask, when is it a good time to be poor? Like, it's really never is a good time to be poor, but to be poor during this time was really bad. But also, in addition to this class of super rich people that we see at this time, the middle class is also rising. Okay, so it's like the urban middle class, which that's what's going to bring us into the progressive era, is this urban middle class really starts to take over politics. And as far as that goes, I think that now this is me. You can find people who would argue differently than me, but I would argue that Rockefeller, Carnegie, Morgan, and Vanderbilt, that they created wealth. And that was part of the reason, because it's not like just a fixed amount or a zero-sum game. That when people do things, to make the economy more efficient and to provide more goods and cheaper and better, the economy grows. Okay, so that's the thing. That's why I typically would call them captains of industry. And I think robber barons is really kind of a myth, because it has the connotation that all this wealth was there and they just hoarded it. So the thing is, as far as that goes, that would be my interpretation there. All right. And can I talk about the major industrialists of the era and their impact? Okay. So I typically remember 4 industrialists from this time. Okay. So you got John D. Rockefeller of Standard Oil, Andrew Carnegie of Carnegie Steel, J.P. Morgan of, just all kinds of stuff, but he was into finance and that sort of thing. And then, of course, Cornelius Vanderbilt with transportation. Okay, so as far as that goes, Carnegie and, Rockefeller to oil, Carnegie to steel, and Vanderbilt to transportation, they all revolutionized these things at that time. Now, also, they were very involved in philanthropy. So when we think about John D. Rockefeller's impact, I always ask students, have you ever had yellow fever? Now, speaking of getting sick, I'm kind of recovering myself, but stay hydrated, kids. All right. So as far as that goes, when we go here, and I ask students, have you gotten yellow fever? And it's like, well, no. Well, thank you, John D. Rockefeller. Okay, because John D. Rockefeller gave money as a philanthropist. Okay, we're talking about philanthropy. He gave money to as far as to cure yellow fever. Also gave money to educational institutions. Carnegie Hall, which is an artistic performing arts center. Then Carnegie funded like 2,000 public libraries. The Vanderbilt University, if any of you are thinking about applying to Vanderbilt, they're called the Commodores, after that was the nickname of Cornelius Vanderbilt. So on one hand, if any of y'all been to the Biltmore in Asheville, North Carolina, Vanderbilt, they had a lot of money. They had a great deal of wealth, but they also, now another thing you'll read about how, if you go to the Biltmore, how Vanderbilt had somebody, like, he bought up all this forest land and he had somebody manage the forest. I mean, so these people were, going into after they made a lot of money, how can I benefit the public? And I think that's important. And when it comes down to it, Yeah, so that was so yeah, Rockefeller. Yeah, I really like Folsom's book because that kind of opened my eyes because I'd heard this robber barons narrative and I'd never really thought about like, oh, nobody kind of went through the thing. And then you realize that a lot of the negative attention that these industrialists get is because of the muckrakers. And of course, the muckrakers, there was use for them. I think that, on one hand, there was a lot of corrupt stuff going on. And I'm not saying that Rockefeller was a complete saint, but at the same time, the muckrakers, they were writing in order to be sensational. Okay, that's they're sensationalizing, and that's what they're doing. And when you think about it, like the Senate, um, the progressive era, I'm soapboxing here a little bit, so y'all just take it or leave it. But for example, the 17th Amendment, it was supposed to make, the direct election of senators was supposed to make the Senate more democratic. But if you go to fec.gov and you look and go search for your senator and go find out where your senator's contributions are coming from, and you'll realize that a lot of your senators' contributions, possibly even the majority, are coming from out of state and from a lot of these rich people and corporations and large donors coming from out of state. And so really the 17th Amendment, it was the result of muckraking. A guy wrote in a Cosmopolitan magazine a series of articles called The Treason of the Senate. Now, of course, the Senate had its possibly its share of corruption, but probably not quite on the level that, the public's being stirred up to believe. And now, as a result, sure, do I get to directly elect my senator? Yes. But is my senator controlled by me? No, my senator is controlled by, national politics and, political money and donations and stuff like that. So that's just something to consider. But remember that the muckrakers, Ida Tarbell wrote a history of the Standard Oil Company, and it was not a very flattering history of the Standard Oil Company. So, and again, some of that's me soapboxing. So take that. Remember, there are different ways to interpret anything, anything in terms of, in terms of history. All right. So the idea of the New South. Okay. Now, as far as that goes, Christina, when we talk about the New South, this is like the industrializing, the industrializing South. Just remember that the South continues to be largely agricultural. Okay. So there's this idea, and I think it comes from a book somebody published at that time, like this is the New South. To the extent, now that's another thing, you could have a great historiographical debate. How different was the New South from the Old South? But as far as economically, sure, there is, there are, of course, we're kind of going into a post-manufacturing economy, but, since the South didn't have as many labor unions, there was a cheaper labor supply there. A lot of those factories that had been up in the Northeast and the Midwest relocated to the South. Like the South had a lot, the textile industry in most of the 20th century was very, very strong in the South. But at the same time, a lot of those jobs now have gone overseas and have been replaced by, jobs that require a lot more technical expertise. Now, as far as socially, of course, after Reconstruction, we know that we've got the beginnings of Jim Crow, okay, the system of institutionalized segregation. And it's really at the turn of the 20th century where you have, the lowest point of American race relations. So those are two things that I would remember about the New South. Okay, so there's some industrializing, but still primarily agricultural for a long time. And then, of course, the whole Jim Crow era. All right, so let me go into here, and I see there are a lot of upvotes here. It's technically a little bit before, but let's go ahead and just quickly explain the Compromise of 1877. Now, the Compromise of 1877 was what ended radical Reconstruction. Okay, now remember that the Republican Party had two factions. You had the radicals, and then you had Lincoln's wing of the Republican Party, the more moderate to conservative Republicans. Now, of course, today, with our current political system, we typically think, if somebody's conservative, they're probably going to be a Republican. But at this time, like the Republican Party had different wings. And so after after Lincoln's assassination, the radical Republicans took control of the party, and that's where you have radical Reconstruction and states under southern states under military governments and whatnot, and making sure that African Americans had full citizenship rights, really an attempted social revolution in the South. Now, in the 1876 election, there were 3 states, South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida. Now, the reason I'm able to remember those, I live in South Carolina. I was born in Louisiana. I like to vacation in Florida. Okay. So I remember those 3 states. Now, it was Samuel Tilden, the Democrat, was 1 electoral vote shy of winning the presidency. And so then Rutherford B. Hayes was the Republican candidate. Now, Rutherford B. Hayes was not a radical Republican. Okay. So, Hayes is coming after Grant. Grant supported radical Reconstruction and the radical wing of the Republican Party. Hayes was really more from that Lincoln wing of the Republican Party. Now, South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana, they all sent two delegations of electors. They could not agree on who won the election. Did the Republicans win or did the Democrats win? Now, we're never going to find any written agreement or anything like that. But essentially what ends up happening here, they put together a commission. The commission, of course, on a party line vote, it had 1 more Republican than Democrat on the committee. And so by a party line vote, they say the Republican won the election. Now, but then it's like, okay, how are we going to get people to accept this? Because, Tilden only needed 1 more vote. You mean to tell me that all of these votes went to the Republican? And so there seems to have been an informal agreement of some sort that if the Republicans could win the election and the southern states would not contest that election, then the remaining troops that were enforcing radical Reconstruction and Republican Party rule in the South would be taken out. And so basically, it's almost like a hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil on both sides, okay? Because there is some, it seems to be a fraudulent election on some level. So on one hand, you're going to turn a blind eye to the election, and the guy that won the election isn't actually going to win. That probably won the election isn't going to win the election. But at the same time, the last remaining southern states were restored to native white democratic rule. And so that's really, it's like the Republicans, okay, we want the White House, the southern white Democrats, we want control of our state governments. And so that's essentially that compromise of 1877. But again, you're not going to see that like the Missouri Compromise or the Compromise of 1850. It's really kind of like on the same level maybe as the corrupt bargain, where it's like, okay, you can read between the lines, fill in the blanks. There must have been some understanding, but it wasn't an official understanding. Okay. And so as far as that goes, okay, looks like we've got a few things here that now the McKinley tariff, Zoe. Now, one thing is that just remember the McKinley tariff was one of many tariffs that was passed during the Gilded Age. What you need to understand for APUSH, now the McKinley tariff could be used as an example, but very high tariff rates. Now, before the Civil War, then you had really a very moderate to low tariff. There was of course back and forth between the North and the South about tariffs. Of course, once the South seceded from the Union and the Civil War and Reconstruction, the Republican majority in Congress raised the tariffs a great deal. Now, the point of this, going all the way back to Hamilton, going to Clay, the American system, that the United States, we need to encourage our infant industries because they can't compete on a level playing field with the European industries, and so we want to help there. So as far as that's concerned, the McKinley tariff is one of several tariffs, but these tariffs, the farmers, okay, they're upset because what's happening is they can't really export their produce. They're not getting top dollar for their produce, and then they're having to pay top dollar for their equipment because of the high tariffs. Okay, so the tariff is one of the things that we see there. Okay. And so then, now the Panic of 1893. Now, remember, as far as just, every single little, so as far as every single little panic, just understand the big understanding here. The Panic of 1893 is to understand that during this time, boom and bust economy, okay, that overall during the Gilded Age, there's some economic growth, but sometimes like 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, okay? So, it's really something like this, and that's how the economy grows. The Panic of 1893 was one of these panics. Now, of course, in the 20th century, we call these recessions and depressions and stuff like that. But to understand that the Panic of 1893 happened, okay, you're a high school student taking a survey level course. And to understand that because of the Panic of 1893, there was a currency crisis, and that's leading people to question the gold standard. And that's leading to the populist movement, which started in 1892. But this gained steam, where, of course, through William Jennings Bryan, populism is finding fertile soil in the Democratic Party. And so the causes and effects. So as far as the effect of the Panic of 1893, you see definitely a rise in the populist movement, which had not been, that prevalent before 1893. All right, so going from there. Now, the effects of the election of 1896, really, I would say the effects were kind of minimal, because what happened was, at the end of the day, the populist candidate, small p, because Bryan was the Democratic nominee, but William Jennings Bryan was defeated in that election. Okay, so he's defeated and McKinley's elected, and so you have, establishment Republican rule. Now, some people call the election of 1896, the first like modern election, because they're taking advantage of modern advertising tactics. McKinley ran a front porch campaign, okay, because basically instead of going everywhere and campaigning, let people come to you, get press releases out in the media and all of that kind of stuff, bribe the people you need to bribe and that sort of thing. So the effects of the election of 1896 is you see that the gold standard, the hard money people, they win. Okay, that William McKinley is elected in 96. The McKinley tariff. Okay, so these policies of high tariffs and the gold standard, all of that stuff, those are going to stick around until like Woodrow Wilson's presidency, where you see, that the income tax, the 16th Amendment's ratified, and the income tax comes to replace the tariff as the primary source of revenue for the federal government. So how did the gold standard affect the economy? Okay, now as far as that goes, the gold standard, the pro of the gold standard is that the money has something to back it up. Okay, like today we have what's called fiat money. If any of you've taken economics, this is money that it has value because the government says it has value. Now, what's technically to stop the government from printing a whole bunch of money and our money becoming worthless? Well, nothing. But, the government hasn't done that. So the United States government, the Federal Reserve, they seem to have a lot of credibility, and our currency tends to hold value. But with the gold standard, okay, this was a time when if you had a $20 bill, then you can bring that to a bank and you can redeem that for $20 in gold. So the gold standard keeps inflation at a minimum, that money is going to hold value. So, and that's part of the reason why you want, why you want to save money. If money wasn't going to hold value, then, if your money wasn't going to hold value, then you would not save it. And so as far as that goes, that's the advantage there, that it keeps inflation low. Now, on the other side of that, it limits the currency supply. And when it comes down to it, sometimes there's not enough money in circulation, and the economy suffers because there's not enough money in circulation. Okay, so as far as that goes, that's the gold standard. But the people, basically the people with money benefit a lot more from the gold standard than the people without money. All right, and so the populist movement. Okay, I've touched on some things here and there. Okay, so as far as the populist movement, you want to know that that is a movement of farmers. Okay, a movement of farmers. Now, farmers before the Civil War, okay, and before this age of industrialization during the Gilded Age in the late 19th century, the majority of Americans had been farmers. That's why the Federalist Party didn't last very long, because they were representing this commercial elite that made up very little of the population, and Jefferson's party was representing the interest of farmers. And so with the industrialization of America, farmers are suddenly realizing they're not a majority in the country anymore. Now, they still made up the single largest group. Okay, so farmers were still about 35 to 40% of the population. But what was happening is that business interests had figured out how to influence public policy. They were lobbying, they were bribing, they were doing all these things. Labor unions were getting together, and they were starting to, have some success, striking and whatnot, and increasing their pay. And farmers, because farmers are so spread out in these rural areas, it's difficult for farmers to advocate for themselves and to form groups in order to advocate for themselves. And so as far as that goes, the populists are thinking, what can we do to make sure that the farmer is not forgotten? And so there are a few things. Now, the biggest thing is that they did not like the gold standard. Okay, they wanted to take the United States off the gold standard, and they wanted bimetallism. They wanted to coin gold and silver. Now, this is something that, of course, is they want to coin, this is going to inflate the currency, but there's going to be more currency for all these people who don't have it and don't have enough in circulation. When there's not enough currency in circulation, it's very hard for the economy to do what it needs to do and for enough buying and selling to go on. Now, another thing, of course, they're against the high tariff, because that's something that didn't help the farmers. So they wanted to promote free trade. They wanted to promote bimetallism. Also, populists wanted a greater amount of democracy. They wanted things like the secret ballot, direct election of senators. These are things that we take for granted today, but the populists wanted them back then. They also wanted more of a role for voter initiatives, that people could sign petitions and put it on the ballot without having to go through the legislature in order to make laws. So, and then they wanted the government, as I'd mentioned earlier, to take over ownership of the railroads, to nationalize the railroads. Okay, so as far as that goes, that's just a little bit about the populists. Now, also remember the Grangers and the Farmers Alliance. These are also in that same box with the populists in these late 19th century agrarian movements. All right. Now, just real quick here, I see this has a lot of upvotes, but it's a little bit out of the time period. Zoe's asking, what were Woodrow Wilson's views on neutrality and nationalism? Now, first of all, when Woodrow Wilson ran for re-election in 1916, his campaign slogan was, "He kept us out of war." Now, the thing is, the operative word "kept." I always tell people, when you hear what a president, what a presidential candidate says about what they say their foreign policy will be, imagine if they did the opposite, which is still vote for him. I remember George W. Bush in 2000. He said that he wanted a more humble foreign policy that's not so interventionist. He said that he didn't believe in nation building, and then look what happened. Okay, so Woodrow Wilson, one of his slogans was he kept us out of war. Now, one thing I didn't know, because I'd never read it in a U.S. history textbook, I read it in another book that I was reading. I just happened to see it, and I actually looked it up somewhere else because I needed to independently verify it. It seemed weird. Woodrow Wilson's campaign used the slogan "America First" in 1916. Now, in 1920, the Republicans used that. Warren G. Harding ran his campaign on the principles of America First. But Woodrow Wilson in 1916, America First. He kept us out of war. I'm going to do what's best for our country. Now, Woodrow Wilson in 1919, okay, when Woodrow Wilson, of course, then 1918, we got into we actually was it 17 or 18, but when we got into the war, I guess it was 18 before we actually got over there. But when Wilson wanted a declaration of war, he was talking about freedom of the seas, but he also said that we need to make the world safe for democracy, going along with this moral missionary foreign policy. And so when it came down to it, Woodrow Wilson in 1919 at the Paris Peace Conference is promoting the 14 points, and Woodrow Wilson became like a poster boy for internationalism. Okay, so when it comes down to it, even though Woodrow Wilson had used nationalism and neutrality to get reelected, really, when he goes to the Paris Peace Conference, he is promoting internationalism. Whereas Woodrow Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt butted heads, because Teddy Roosevelt's big stick foreign policy was very much about doing what's best for the United States. It was a very nationalistic foreign policy. Whereas Woodrow Wilson is thinking, we need to do what is morally right, and we need to do what's best for the world. We need to support democratically elected regimes, even if these regimes aren't friendly to the interest of the United States. So, Zoe, you're going to see Wilson on the APUSH exam more emphasizing like the internationalist side, but I think it's still a good piece of context in terms of thinking about, in 1916, the re-election campaign focusing on neutrality and Wilson having kept us out of war. Okay, so let's see, Tyler. I'm not sure that I can that I'm seeing what you're quite getting what you're asking here. Now, as far as legislation during the late 19th century, let's see. Oh, okay. You know what? APUSH rocks. You and I should talk sometime. We need to have a little DM me on Twitter or something like that, or if I follow you, if I don't follow, I believe I follow you, but yeah, you and I should definitely talk. So as far as that goes, conditions and corruption. Now, the Pendleton Civil Service Act, that is the biggest thing, focusing on corruption. Now, you've also got the Interstate Commerce Commission, the Sherman Antitrust Act, which wasn't really that effective, but at the same time, those are the main federal laws that are being passed at that time, but not a lot of labor-friendly legislation that you're going to see passing during the Gilded Age. Let's see, Ronald, again, just when, like, the Panic of 1873, I'm going to tell, like, you're not going to see that anywhere. Like, don't get too deep into the weeds where you're missing the forest. You're not, you're missing the forest because you're looking too closely at the trees. So, what you really need to understand is, here is the boom and bust, okay? The boom and bust and what's going on there, that these panics happen. What a panic was, it happened, and what's the effect? The effect is people want, when the economy's bad, they want more radical measures. So, of course, the Panic of 1893, we see that the populist movement gained steam. Now, as far as 1873, that's one thing that, if I'm not mistaken, let me just look this up real quick. 1874 House of Representatives. Okay, so let me just take a, this was, okay, so one thing that you could note here is that 1873, now, while you don't need to know it in particular, this is one of the things that's turning public opinion against the Republican Party, specifically against the policies, the Reconstruction policies of Grant. But the Democratic Party, in 1874, gains control of the House of Representatives. Now, by a pretty decisive margin, 183 to 106, okay? Whereas before that, they'd held 89 seats to the Republicans' 109. So 94, over 90 seats changed hands. Now, before that, if we go back here, okay, so you see the Republican majority there, a very decisive majority. So throughout most of the time with radical Reconstruction, you see that the Republicans, have a majority in the House of Representatives, okay? And so as far as that goes, when you think about the Panic of 1873, this really, broke like the Republican Party's monopoly on the federal government and brought the Democratic Party, like you're seeing more divided government through the rest of the Gilded Age. While all of the presidents, except for Grover Cleveland in his divided, two-term presidency, two non-consecutive terms, you see that now the Democrats are, becoming more powerful in Congress. Okay, so you're seeing that they tend to be the majority party in these, at this time, and so going from there, where we get to. And of course, well, let's see. I don't see a map on that one, but all right. So with that, I would say that if you're noting that, that would be one of the reasons why you see the decline in support for radical Reconstruction. So that kind of spills over, the economy spills over into Reconstruction policy as well. Let's see. Yeah, Zoe, I don't know that I'd necessarily, I'm sure there's a link, but I wouldn't try, too hard. Certainly with, the increased consumerism of the 1920s, there are some new inventions that are happening there. I wouldn't reach too far back on there. How did the Civil War affect the economy? Sounds like somebody's working on an LEQ, because that's that's an LEQ topic. So it sounds like you're doing your homework. Remember those laws that were passed during the Civil War, the Pacific Railway Act, the Homestead Act, the increased tariff, and essentially a lot of these Republican policies that I've been talking about in this broadcast. All right. Can I expand on religious movements during the Gilded Age? Religion's not going to be a major topic of emphasis during this time, but you might want to look at, first of all, the gospel of wealth, which this is the rich man's gospel. Like Andrew Carnegie wrote the book, The Gospel of Wealth, that essentially wealthy people should try to improve society, but they need to do that on their own terms. Okay. And then of course there's the social gospel that's really kind of a merger of Christian thought and socialist thought at the same time. But as far as, religion, it's not a major, topic during this time, like when you're looking at the, the First Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening, the rise of conservatism, of the new conservatism during the 70s and 80s. Which of the political parties were against immigration? It's not so much that you've got a pro-immigrant and anti-immigrant party. I wouldn't politicize that too much, because a lot of times these are, like right now, when you look at, our current politics, where, people who want to reduce levels of immigration overwhelmingly tend to be Republicans, and, Democrats tend to be more supportive of immigration policies. It hasn't always been that polarized. So I wouldn't necessarily look at the partisan element. I would look more at the general feeling in the United States, such as, during the 1920s, where you have the Immigration Quota Acts, where there was a lot of, a popular nativist, a lot of popular nativist sentiment during that time. And I wouldn't put a partisan label on it necessarily. Why were unions so important to laborers in the late 19th century? Okay, well, the thing is, because they're barely being paid anything, and they were working in harsh conditions and a lot of hours. So labor unions, that's a way for workers to band together and advocate for themselves, in a way. And especially now, the thing is, the more skilled the laborers are, the better it works. Okay, because if the laborers are unskilled, then you can just replace them. You can fire them all, replace them very easily. That's why teachers are able to effectively unionize in a lot of states, because when you think about it, if all the teachers walk off the job, a teacher, that's not a position that can be like easily filled. Okay, that's not necessarily so. As far as that goes, not a piece of lead, that can't be easily filled. And so laborers, it just basically, remember, the role of labor unions was to increase pay, reduce hours, and better working conditions. Okay, why did William Jennings Bryan lose the 1896 presidential election? Well, he got less votes in the Electoral College. Also, the thing is that although, Bryan had the support of the Populists, and that's nice, it's still, Bryan, people are scared of populism sometimes. I mean, look at, the Trump phenomenon, the Bernie phenomenon. A lot of people are scared of politicians like that. Think about now, like, for example, like, when Bryan, it's like, this guy's got the backing of the populists. This guy's probably dangerous. He's not going to keep things stable. And so, William McKinley, of course, his campaign was a lot better coordinated, a lot better funded. McKinley had a lot better connections. He was older and more established. But at the same time, he was able to paint himself as somebody who was going to keep things stable, because, things had gotten a little better since the Panic of 1893 by 1896. So, he's not going to destroy the currency. Fear is a big thing in politics. Now, also, it's just typically you want to be seen in a general election as the more moderate candidate. For example, in 2020, I don't think that the Democratic nominee is going to be making a whole bunch of appearances during the general election with Ocasio-Cortez. It's probably the Democratic nominee, after getting the Democratic nomination, is going to want to show, like, look, I am, I'm here from the center, and that sort of thing. So we'll see. I think the 2020 election could be somewhat interesting. We'll see what happens there. But William Jennings Bryan, it's like, when you look at him getting the endorsement of the Populists, he was an enthusiastic supporter of bimetallism. People were just scared. The McKinley campaign put out, like, basically, that your dollars are going to turn into dimes. They actually passed out coins, and it was pretty brilliant. Okay, and Julia, I've already addressed new immigration in the early 1900s in a previous section of this broadcast. So as far as that goes, I think everything here. Now that is a great question, APUSH Rocks. I can't. I'm not sure about that. Now, see, that's the thing. Like, that's really. We have to get these kids ready for exams, and we have to learn there's a whole bunch of stuff we have to learn about. And sometimes I feel like we miss out on some of the cool stuff. Like, I feel like the generation of teachers that came before us, they knew a lot more cool stories than we know. And I think we've lost something because of that, to be quite forthright. Let me know when you look into that. Let me know, what you find. I'd definitely like to hear about that. And so as far as that, we got a couple more questions, but these are on things I've already addressed, and our hour is up. We've had, we've had a good crowd tonight. And remember that for the foreseeable future, Fiveable's a new company. It's trying to figure out what, every company has to make money, but every company has to, also figure out, how do we serve the public? How do we make money? And so when I'm talking to, Amanda at Fiveable, they're still trying to kind of figure out. But one thing that they have said is that these sessions, these once a week sessions, are going to be open to the public through the remainder of the semester, or at least through like mid-April. So I'm looking forward to seeing y'all again. Tell your friends about these things. I'll see y'all at the same time next Wednesday night. All right. Y'all have, a wonderful evening, and it is always a pleasure.